Hey, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. Today's conversation is with Stacey Freedenthal, who is a clinical social worker and a suicidologist and an associate professor at University of Denver in the Graduate School of Social Work. So, suicidologist, is that a new word or is that?
I think it was coined in the 60s
Uh,
and by Ed Schneidman, who's considered sort of the modern father of suicidology. And if you type it into certain programs like Microsoft Word,
uh
it will get the red squiggly line underneath,
Which
but
means
it that it's not a real word.
I get it. Okay, that's funny. Yeah, but
But
we're
it is. It
we're
is a real.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about Twitch later because it wasn't our plan when we scheduled this, but now it's so sad and hard to ignore and certainly on topic. But I just want to start out with a little background, which is as a therapist, what led you to this specialization in suicide?
Sure. There was a professional pathway and a personal pathway, and the professional pathway is that I started volunteering at a suicide hotline even before I became a social worker. In my previous life, I was a journalist, and and I wanted to know how to help people and not just to report on tragedy and quote them for an article in the paper, but actually say something helpful or do something helpful. And then I liked it so much, volunteering at the suicide hotline, which I know can sound kind of weird to people who, don't have that proclivity, but when you do, it was just immensely rewarding. And so I went to school to get my master's in social work. And thereafter, every job that I had after even during my MSW, but after as well, was in some kind of crisis setting where I was encountering people who had suicidal thoughts. And it just grew from there. And then I got my PhD, and it's what I've been writing about, what I've been researching about as a therapist. It's what I specialize in, although I treat people, with other issues as well. So that's my professional path. Personally, um, I myself had suicidal thoughts as an adolescent, starting as an adolescent. So, this is relevant for parents of teens. And in my on and off, I had them. And then in my 20s, I actually attempted suicide more than once. And and then I also, when I was 15, uh, a friend of mine died by suicide. He was the second suicide in my school in 5 days. And so just all of this, and I have a family member, well, I have multiple family members who have had suicidal thoughts. So all these things just have combined to make me very passionate about the topic.
Yeah, it's like you were destined to be there and help other people. So we're grateful. You do great work. I've read a lot of your stuff. And
Thank you.
when I was talking to your publicist and I was saying how excited's the wrong word, but I often feel less satisfied about certain conversations when we interview people. And I found your answers to be really satisfying, like really concrete and things that parents can do in particular with their teens to either deal with an acute situation or not acute where you should call 911, but one that you're worried about. Or wait, 988 now, right? 988.
Either. I mean, it's a little confusing. 988 for emotional, but if somebody has taken an overdose and needs immediate medical attention, then
Yeah.
it should be 911.
Okay. So what I want to start with, because it just happened, is when a public figure like Twitch dies by suicide, someone who we may love from So You Think You Can Dance, or if you watched the Ellen show, I mean, this was a lovable every guy, right? Like we knew him. And from the public's perspective, he had everything. He looked happy, and it's shocking. So I have a few questions on that. Like, do we talk to our kids about this? Let's start with that one.
I say absolutely. We talk with our kids about this, even if they don't appear to have challenges right now. Even if they seem happy, it's an important topic to speak openly about, so that then down the road, if there is a problem, they know that they can talk with you about it. And they know that you won't judge them if they have suicidal thoughts, or that you won't panic, assuming that you've been able to have a conversation without judgment and panic. Then that can lay the groundwork. And then it's all the more important, you have this conversation and, oh my gosh, they are thinking of suicide right now. That's really important to know. And that doesn't mean, I always want to be careful in these kinds of conversations to convey that it doesn't mean that somebody who has lost somebody to suicide did everything wrong. Even when we do things right, quote, quote, right, tragedy can occur. But it can certainly help set the stage and open the door, whatever, sayings you want to use to bring it up.
Okay, I'm walking because I just noticed that my computer is about to die, which is a rookie move in the middle of an interview. But if for some reason I lose you before I plug this in, you can keep talking and I will jump back on. So the question I want to put out there is that I hear two different things. One is that we have to worry because there's like a copycat trend that happens with suicide. And then the other is we should talk about it a lot because we want to take away the stigma. So what do we do with those two pieces of information?
It's a paradox, that we know that talking about suicide, that asking about suicidal thoughts in particular, that doing, on the professional side, doing a risk assessment interview, we know that that does not increase suicidal thoughts, or even worse, trigger suicidal thoughts. It doesn't cause suicidal thoughts in somebody who doesn't have them. There's this fear that we'll give somebody the idea, but the reality is that idea is already there. It's like, me giving you the idea to go to sleep tonight. You already know that you're going to go to sleep tonight. Usually. So,
it reminds me a little bit of when you lose a family member and people, or a loved one, and people don't want to bring it up because they might make you sad.
yes.
Like, of course you're sad. You're grieving. You're sad. You're just showing love. So it's kind of, to me, like a little parallel.
That's a great analogy, because the fear is, oh, I'll upset them. And they're already upset. And it's not like somebody who's lost a family member has forgotten, and now you're going to remind them. It's ever present. And so there's research. I'm fascinated by this research that shows that most 6-year-olds know that people in their life, and they don't know the word suicide, but they know that people die by suicide, with using a different language for them. But by age 8, I'm using ages, but that's because I'm aligning them with grades. But by 3rd grade, most kids know the word suicide.
Wow.
So they know it's out there, and they know people do this, and some of them want to die by suicide. We know that there's research that 3-year-olds have suicidal thoughts.
Wow. Okay, first I just want to tell you that Noreen says hi. Noreen Vanderhoeven says
Aww.
hi. So yes, we should be talking about this, but then what's the other side of this in terms of copycat? Like, schools get terrified when there's a loss. It's terribly sad, but then how much do you bring kids together to grieve together and all these things because they're worried that it will lead to more?
I think for me, the distinction is between speech and action. That talking about suicide doesn't trigger suicide, but when somebody dies by suicide, that can be, not that alone causes suicide, but it is correlated with more suicide. And then in the severe tragedies, we have clusters where one teen died, and not just teens, but I'm using that as an example for this interview. One teen dies by suicide, and then another and another and another. And sometimes what happens, various things can cause that. One is, oh my gosh, that person did what I thought was impossible, and now I realize it's possible. Or, oh my gosh, they have a whole assembly dedicated to them, at school, and everybody's upset and saying all these really great things about them. Well, I could be the center of that attention. Not I don't mean to say that it's attention seeking by any means,
Right, right.
but we're human, and humans want to be cared for and loved, and there can be this kind of fantasy, was it Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer? There can be this fantasy that we'll be at our own funeral and see everybody loving us.
Okay, so you already said that we should talk to our kids about this and even pose the question.
Yes, but can I say one more thing about, I just had a thought.
Sure.
Which doesn't happen all the time. So when I have a thought, I feel like I need to honor it.
Go for it. Go for it.
I just want to talk about when Kurt Cobain died. There was a lot of concern because he was such, a popular and mesmerizing musician, especially among young people. And there was huge concern that his death would trigger other suicides, because over the years that has happened, that when a celebrity dies by suicide, there's a spike in suicides around that time. And so the suicide prevention community was extremely concerned about this. And they made a really concerted effort to reach out to the media and say, hey, whenever you report about his death, please also give the number of the local hotline or the national lifeline. And what researchers found is during that time is suicides did not go up, but calls to hotlines did. So I think, that shows that the content of what we say is important. If we romanticize suicide, and if we spread myths about suicide, if we give positive attention in ways that might not be productive or healthy, then that can appears to do harm. But if we use our words to urge people to get help, or to help them understand that various things we can talk about, or to listen, then good can come of it. Not that good can come of suicide, but good can come of talking about
prevention, with prevention. So one of the things I want to move into now is, what are the tools that parents can use? And I don't mean like be with your kid, but I mean very concrete. So for example, you say talk to your kid and ask the question. And I want to know in words, what is the question I ask? Because I would have thought, are you thinking about harming yourself, could be a vaguer, more comfortable way to say it, but I don't think those are the same things.
They are not the same things, but it is the go-to that people will say, are you thinking of hurting yourself, or are you thinking of harming yourself? When they really mean, are you thinking of killing yourself? And this is one of my pet topics with therapists, because even therapists will skirt the topic and say things like, do you think of harming yourself? And the problem with this is there's multiple problems. One is that self-harm isn't always suicidal. Many people who self-harm, they do it as a way to cope. And in fact, there have been interviews with people where they say, I cut myself in order to avoid killing myself. That the way I cope with my suicidal despair is to harm myself. And so, so a lot of people, if you say, are you thinking of harming yourself? And they say, yes, well, now you're thinking they have suicidal thoughts, but they may not. The opposite is also true, that many people with suicidal thoughts don't view suicide as self-harm. They view it as ending the hurt, not hurting themselves.
Okay, so you said the question is, are you thinking of killing yourself? Like uttering those words, they're hearing the words. It's so jarring. Do we need to practice that just in front of a mirror or with a spouse or a friend? Like, how do you get those words out?
That's a great idea. In my classes, I teach classes on suicide assessment at University of Denver. And in my excuse me, and in my classes, there's a role play assignment where people are video recorded, and then I, in a mock role play where they play the role of therapist. And even in this mock role play, where the person sitting in front of them they know isn't actually suicidal, or if they are, they're not going to talk about it because it's a class assignment. Even then, people are afraid to ask, and it's a contrived situation. And I've had people who go through the whole interview and keep referring to these thoughts or it, or they talk around the topic without naming it. And so but it is important to name it, but we also don't need to be completely brusque about it. It's not like, hey, how are you doing? Are you thinking of killing yourself?
But I think that I've seen use of repetition of language to take away the power of the language. And maybe here's a place where you practice saying it enough that, like, this is the first time I ever said it aloud and I felt myself pause, right? So maybe the second time I say it, I'm like, oh, well, I got through it once. Let me try again. And maybe if we do that, by the time we sit down with our kids, we're a little more comfortable. I don't know.
I think that's a great idea. In fact, the suicide hotline that I volunteered for in Dallas in the 90s, I had to do 54 hours of training and then observation on top of that. But many of those hours of training were role playing, and getting used to talking about the topic and being aware of that reaction that you just described, like being aware, like, oh my gosh,
Mhm.
I have this fear. What is this fear? And then working through it. And I think before the show, you had said something about how can we not be afraid? And I would say, even if we are afraid, I think there's almost always some fear. And I've had some therapists and training say, well, I would never be afraid of asking that. And then when you role play with them, they're saying things like, do you think of harming yourself?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And they don't use the words. And so I think, those are important things. But I'm sorry, I just kind of got a little distracted. What was your question that I can return to?
I don't know either, but it was a good conversation. But I'm going to move on because one of the things I really felt so excited about talking to you about was giving us the language. So,
Yes.
what do we say wrong when we are brave enough to get those words out, or even not brave enough, but just do it with quivers? I think like the fear is they say yes, and then what do? I don't know what to do. So tell us first what we say that isn't helpful, and then I know you've written articles. One says 10 things to say and 10 things not to say, and maybe Jessica could put that in the chat. But if you could tell us some of them right now.
Sure. Well, something that I often see or hear, and this is in colloquial language, not usually by a mental health professional, and that's, you're not thinking of doing anything stupid, are you? Or you're not thinking of doing anything crazy, right? Or even if they use the word suicide, they ask it in a way where they make the desired answer clear, like, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? Which I compare to, there's one piece of chocolate cake left and my husband and I are both eyeing it. And I say to him, you're not thinking of eating that, are you? And then he knows, no, saunters off. If we ask the question that way, we're making clear that we want the answer to be no.
Well, that we aren't strong enough to hear an answer yet. Yes, right? Like that's what we've done.
And I think, I think this is human, but I think it's also a challenge. And that's that the person asking is so scared that they may center their own needs, and so that question, you're not thinking of suicide, are you, is centering their own needs over the other person's needs.
Okay, my inclination would be to counter everything that they said. Well, I don't feel loved. What are you talking about? You're so loved.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
I mean, trying to shine light on a reality that they're just not seeing. And if only I tell them, it will make all the difference.
And you want that, and you want them to see it. And yet they don't. And so I'll give you an example from the suicide hotline. One of the very first calls I observed was somebody who, in the course of the call, said, "I'm a terrible person. I don't deserve to live. I want to kill myself." And I was observing the call, and the counselor said, "You're not a terrible person. You're a good person, and you deserve to live." And the caller said, "Oh my God, I'd never thought of that. Thank you." No, I'm kidding. If I remember correctly, I mean, it was many years ago. If I remember correctly, the caller hung up.
So,
And
okay, so tell us what is a better way if our inclination is to try to bolster somebody and hug them with our words, what is a better response than that?
I mean, there are some people, like when I give talks about this, I'll have somebody come up to me and say, "Well, when somebody said to me you're lovable, it changed my life, and I wanted to live again." So there are some people who will respond positively to that. But in the main, what I see more often is that if somebody immediately is invalidated in what they say, that they feel alone, they feel unheard, they feel like the other person doesn't want to hear it or can't handle hearing it. And sometimes it makes them feel more hopeless,
So
and
invalidating is a good word, because none of us would be meaning to do that, right? That's not the intent at all. It's the opposite, but that's how it's perceived by the person we're saying it to.
absolutely, absolutely. And at the same time, people will say to me, "Well, I don't want to validate it." Like this person who says, "I'm a terrible person. I don't deserve to live." I don't want to say, "Yeah, you're right. You're a terrible person. You don't deserve to live." But validation doesn't, I mean, validation has many meanings, but in this context, validation doesn't mean agreement or endorsement. Validation means acknowledging that what acknowledging what they're saying without refuting it or
And
rebutting
it
it.
be something like, "That must be so hard to live with."
Yes. Yes. That, "Oh my God, that's so painful. Tell me more." You
So
know?
what I love when you say, "Tell me more," is I can do that over and over again. Does it start to be transparent to the other person if I just keep saying, maybe I change it up a little bit and I say, "I'm really curious about that," or "Can you fill in some of the things I might not know?" Does that work as a rule?
I wouldn't say as a rule, and I
Well,
mean,
say something as a rule.
yeah, I would say, very, very, very much of the time. I mean, it's at the basis of crisis intervention models. It's at the basis of hostage negotiation tactics, is to repeat back what the person says, or to ask questions in a way that deepens exploration, that gives them permission to say more, that doesn't, again, center your own needs to hear a certain response. So, and when I have clients who I do that with, they say, I can't talk about this with anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you want to be the person who they trust, we have to think about it differently. So give me one more example of like commonly said things that are just not helpful.
You're so young. How could you have so much to live for? How could you think of suicide? Or you think this obviously is egregious, but sometimes it's said more subtly, which is, you think you have problems. you know you don't have problems. Your biggest concern is an algebra test tomorrow. You're not paying bills, you're not paying rent. Obviously that's not constructive, but people will say it in ways that aren't as obviously unempathic.
The one that comes to mind for me is that when I hear about it happening to someone else dying by suicide, my thought is, how did they leave those kids? Right? Like, how did their parents, like, how did they do this to their parents? Right? So is that compelling to somebody to say, like, you are going to leave so much pain in your wake?
Well, in fact, that's one of the responses that I discourage, which is, how could you think of doing that to me?
Yeah.
How could you think of hurting me like that? And there's some disagreement about this. There was this Twitter debate about a year ago where a very prominent psychiatrist said that he guilts people. I don't think he used that word, but I don't think that was his exact sentence, but he said, he explicitly says, think of all the people that you would be hurting if you killed yourself, and how you need to not do that for them. And again, there's always going to be somebody who that works for. But in the main, I think it's a really destructive thing to say for various reasons. The most, I'm sorry.
So I want to get us like another one of what to say. And I was only reading your stuff, so I'm sure I got it from you, but ask 2 questions. Where does it hurt and how can I help?
Yeah, that's from Ed Schneidman, who really was a pioneer in researching suicide. And he said those are the 2 questions he asked, not do you have a plan? Do you have the means? Do you have access to the means? When would you do it? I mean, those questions are important at some point, but the very first thing should be an invitation for the person to tell you what it is that they're going through.
Okay, I think I'm going to run a little over today because I have 2 more questions for you. So one is that this idea of when to have these conversations, I kind of was thinking as I was preparing for the interview that it's because I'm worried about somebody, that I'm seeing signs that something has changed. But Twitch made me rethink that, because to the public, and I don't know if to his family, he seemed so happy. So is this an ongoing conversation we have? Like how do we know when it's time to ask these questions, or should we be asking them in general?
We definitely should be asking them. And one thing that I think could be really useful for people to hear is, I mentioned earlier that we don't need to be completely brusque about it. There are techniques that a psychiatrist named Sean Shea has written about. They're called validity techniques, where you're trying to get valid information. And one of the techniques he talks about is normalization. And of course, we don't want to normalize suicide itself, but suicidal thoughts are not completely abnormal. 15 million people in the United States a year seriously consider suicide. 1 in 5 high school students say that they seriously considered suicide in the previous year. So we can normalize that sometimes people, they're hurting so badly that they want to end it by dying. And depending on what the person is saying to us, like say they're really depressed and we're worrying, or they seem depressed, maybe they're not even articulating it. And we can say, sometimes it seems like things have been different for you. And sometimes when people change a lot in how they're interacting with others, or sleep or whatever, that sometimes they are having thoughts of suicide. Do you have thoughts of suicide? So then we've established that we know this happens, other people experience it too, and we can handle it with that kind of question.
That's really helpful. I wanted to end on this idea of a safety plan.
Although, Sue, can I just interrupt real fast?
You always can, yes.
I thought we were going an hour. We're only going half an hour?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't, that you didn't have enough. See, look, this is me saying, but you have everything to live for, and you going, aha.
The truth is, I watched a bunch of your interviews and they were an hour and they could have gone on much longer, but we try to be mindful. We're in the middle of the day, we're grabbing people away from work, and so keep them to about a half hour. So if we could end with, this felt good to me. It's like doing something always feels good to me, instead of walking away from a conversation and being like, now what? So tell me what a safety plan is and how it can be effective.
Yes. And this is your what if they say yes question. If you ask if somebody's having suicidal thoughts and they say yes, most importantly, listen, don't rebut, don't persuade, don't shut them down. And then if it's evident that they are in immediate danger, they're holding a bottle of pills that they're about to take, or they're going to go home and there's a firearm that they're going to use, that kind of thing, then get them to a hospital or a crisis center. Don't leave the person alone. But if they're not in immediate danger, we don't need to panic and we don't need to call 911. And we can talk with them about ways to stay safe, and that's safety planning. And there's a great website, www.suicidesafetyplan.com. I think it's com. Suicidesafetyplan.com. If that doesn't work, try .org, but I'm pretty sure it's .com. And it's got the form, and there's research that people who are given this, not given the form, but talked through the form in emergency rooms are less likely to attempt suicide than those who aren't. And the safety plan involves helping the person identify triggers, things that make them vulnerable to suicidal thoughts or show that a crisis may be brewing, helping them come up with ways that they can cope themselves, and being very specific, because in a crisis, they're not able to think like, who should I call? Like it's good for them to have the specific name and number. Although actually I'm skipping ahead, because the first step is what they can do by themselves, then where they can go for distraction, and that can be people they can be around. Then the next step is people they can ask for help, and that tends to be friends and family, teachers, things like that. And then the next step is professionals, like mental health professionals, a clinic. And then the last step is ways that they can make their environment less dangerous. Like if they have pills, what can they do with those, or what can somebody else do with those pills to keep them safe? If there's a firearm in the house, what needs to be done to keep them safe? And an important thing I want to impress about safety planning is it is not a contract or a promise, because those can have counterproductive effects to require someone to promise that they'll follow it. The most obvious being that people don't always keep that promise. Second most obvious being that then if they do attempt suicide and they've promised not to, they may not tell you. And you want to know. I don't want to create any barrier to them telling me. So I do want to distinguish between a safety plan and then a safety contract. And that's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so Jessica found the site. It is suicidesafetyplan.com.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you for checking that.
Yeah, and thank you for giving that resource, because I think it sounds like that's something you think of in advance, not in the moment. So look it up and check it out and have it in your back pocket, right? Like
literally.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Stacey Freedenthal, this was so valuable. Where do you want to send people for more information?
Well, I mean, obviously to my book, Loving Someone with Suicidal Thoughts.
You have it next to you, right? You want to hold it up?
Yes. I have 10 copies next to me that I got from the publisher this week, but this is Loving
Someone with Suicidal Thoughts. Okay.
What family, friends, and partners can say and do. And then my website, speakingofsuicide.com, which you alluded to with the articles about 10 things to say and 10 things not to say. And there's also an article about 10 reasons teens don't tell their parents.
Oh.
And it's got some of what we've talked about, the responses like, how could you hurt me like that? And then the Lifeline is an extremely important resource, 988. It's also 1-800-273-TALK, but it's been shortened to 988 so that it's comparable to 911, but for mental health reasons.
Okay, so helpful, and I'm just so grateful for what you have to offer in a very, I want to tell everybody, when you go check out her site, you're going to so appreciate how much it speaks to us. And it's not academic and it's not incomprehensible. It's really making it accessible for all of us. So thank you for being here with us and sharing all this wisdom.
Thank you for having me.